Hey guys, welcome to the Izkimar Podcast. How are y'all doing today?
Doing good.
Doing great.
That's awesome. So, y'all are both Texas boys. Y'all both have some formal education in the computer science background, and it seems both of y'all started from more tech backgrounds before y'all moved into gaming. Would y'all both care to fill us in on your backgrounds and where this all started for y'all?
Go first.
Uh,
I should go first.
you should go first because you've been doing it longer.
Yeah. So I'm just yes, I was trained as a programmer. I programmed before I was trained as a programmer. I went and got the degree after I knew how to program. Uh, yeah, I think that if you're going to make games, you better know something about the medium that you're on, and computers are our medium. The interactive, computers are what we do to get people excited because it's a control medium. People want to see it react to them. It's not a passive medium. So interactivity is the key, and that's only on computers. So, or with other people, and we kind of do both. We do the computer thing and the other people thing. So that's what makes doing massively multiplayer online games fun. Is they're hard to do technically, and they're hard to do from a social aspect too.
Yeah. So I did have a technical background, but not as much as yours. You were electrical engineering. Is that right?
No, I was computer science first and double E minor.
Okay. So I was actually a business major with a computer science minor. So I was just technical enough to get myself into trouble in my early forays into gaming back in the tech-based mud days. I did, after I got out of college, I had a brief stint as a network DBA. And that's really where I beefed up my data modeling and data architecture skills. And then my first company was a tech company that did database translations, basically moving information from one large database schema to another. And I did that for a good 4 or 5 years. So before I ever jumped over to games, I had a really strong working knowledge of how data should interconnect and how data should be organized for large-scale systems. That's a surprisingly helpful skill to have in MMOs. In fact, it's an area that I wish more designers would get some basic awareness of because, when I naturally think about designing systems now, I have a tendency to keep the data model in mind the whole time, and it allows us to arrange it in such a way that we don't paint ourselves into corners later. But long before that, I was a gamer. I mean, I've been doing tabletop and PC gaming since, well, basically as long as there have been PCs. Not as long as there have been tables, but as long as there have been PCs.
Okay, and so with your business management degree, would you say that really prepared you for what you were going to be getting into going into the game industry?
Not really. So I definitely see a tremendous amount of value in formal training for computer science because it's just such an alien thing. In business management, at least with an undergrad degree, I didn't concentrate on finance, which there's a whole methodology to it. And I didn't concentrate on accounting, so where there's a whole methodology. I spent most of my classes in marketing, which this was, when I was in school, this was really advent of internet. So all of the cool stuff they figured out how to do now with micro-targeting and stuff like that, none of that existed back then. And then in management, a lot of it was case studies and common sense and, quite frankly, lessons that were hard to learn looking at it from afar. I really feel like it's the kind of thing where you have to learn by making mistakes, and the only way to make mistakes is to jump in and do it. And a lot of the things that really make you good as an entrepreneur aren't usually touched in business school. Like, crap, I've got to raise some money. How do I do that? What's the formal sales process for business development to go out and find investors and pitch them and convince them that your venture is worth backing? They don't really teach that in school. You have to learn it again by doing it and being really bad at it for a long time until eventually you kind of become good at it because you learn all the ways to fail.
Basically getting tossed to the wolves.
Pretty much. And I think Wolfpack was a pretty effective learning lesson at that.
Yeah. And staying on the schooling subject, I also noticed, correct me if I'm wrong, you had a minor in religious studies as well?
I did, but I mostly did that because I found it fascinating.
Right.
And the classes were always enjoyable and never super challenging on a homework standpoint. I mean, I wasn't taking like upper level. Let's go through and let's decipher the Dead Sea Scrolls kind of stuff. I was taking like narrative religion, and compare. I had one of my classes at one point was on fantasy literature, for example, like mythological studies as it relates to fantasy literature. So I found that stuff to be pretty easy and highly enjoyable.
Yeah, and
one per semester, basically.
And reading that, it got me wondering: was there ever a point in time in which a mechanic or system that was designed was inspired by anything you learned in that background?
My narratives always are. I mean, if you look at the narrative stories that I put together pretty much across all my games, you can see strong influences of any number of different religions. Just because I find, the idea of religion, I think, is pretty fascinating. Because it's common across all cultures, regardless of where you're born or when you're born. There's a drive inside of us to go, hey, what's the meaning of all this? I'm in this box that I can't see out of, and how do I give it meaning, and and where did it come from, and why am I here? And I think that's pretty fascinating. So I find that has been a major influence for me in everything I've done from a creative standpoint.
Jordan, your game development stint started more in the 80s or so. What were some of the first projects that you worked on?
I actually started in the 70s, so not far away. So, I mean, I did standalone games for 17 years before I even looked at an MMO. So, I've spent now a little over 22 years working on MMOs. So, and I think that, all games are interesting, and all games are hard to do. Whether they're good or bad, they're hard to do first.
Yeah, every MMO is a miracle. Is that what you say?
Almost every game is a miracle. Right? Every MMO is like a miracle squared or cubed. Yeah. So I think that, the challenge is always how are you going to build something that's going to entertain people and engage them. And so there's a whole bunch of decisions that go into that. Thousands of decisions for the simplest game, tens of thousands of decisions for the bigger games. And so I like it. It's complex. It's difficult. It's challenging. It's hard to get everybody rowing in the same direction when you have a lot of people, to get them all to visualize what you're trying to do and build that, rather than kind of build a bunch of things and rebuild it 16 times before you get there.
There's a bit of gambling in it too, right? Because there are some things you can't control. Like, does a new competitor appear off the horizon, at X day in the project? And if so, how are you going to deal with that? Do you even care? Do the customers completely change? Like, hey, I was working on this particular console platform, and then all of a sudden, nobody bought it. Everybody bought this other one. And now how do I deal with that? Like, there's all the unknowns as well that can be huge boons to you, or they can be huge challenges to you, and you just have to deal with it. So that adds a bit of the gambler's addiction to it, right? Is because you're betting on horses at the end of the day, and a bunch of your decisions are outside of your control, or a bunch of the factors that determine if you win or lose are outside of your control.
Yep.
Sounds like a nightmare at times.
Well, it depends on what you're looking for in life. If you're looking for challenges, it's the exact right place. If you're looking for like a high percentage chance of success, without having to work too hard, it's definitely the wrong place.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, you started in the very early days of the game development industry, even more than I thought, going back to the 70s. And J. Todd, you got in pretty early as well, especially in the early lifespan of online gaming, as that goes.
Yeah, for MMOs, certainly not from a game standpoint, but from an MMO standpoint, when I was getting out of Reliant, my first company, our UO was still in beta when I was there. And when I left, the UO was out, but EQ was still in testing. I think I might be a little off in that, but if so, not by much. So.
And so, what major differences would you highlight from the way the the process, the people approach the process back then versus the way we do it in modern times.
Well,
What's improved? What's gotten worse? What's the same?
Back then, nobody had any idea what was possible and what was not, right? I mean, that's just, it was a very different, it was an utterly different playing field, because you'd say, hey, we're going to do this. And I don't know if that's going to work. Nobody'd ever tried anything before. So at least now you've got 20 years worth of games that have come out, MMOs that have come out, that you can point to certain systems and go, hey, this didn't work, or this did work. Or if it didn't work, here's why we think it didn't work, even though the base idea could work if we reworked it like this, that, or the other. Back then, there was nothing like that. Like most online games that were prolific were text-based on the internet before the web and topped out at 100 players concurrent, right? So, I mean, when UO hit, it was really just a fundamentally different thing. And I mean, at the time, it felt more like a new genre than I mean, clearly it was, but we just didn't know what the hell it was, right, when that first hit. So since then, it's not just that everything has changed, because everything has. And I mean by that, customer expectations, how you reach the customers, how you build the customers, what they'll pay for, what technology platform you use, what technology platform you're going after, your internationalization, your customer support techniques, your QA process, your building process, your art pipeline, the art tools, the engineering tools, like literally everything has changed. But it's not just that it's changed once. All of it changes at a rate of about once every 4 to 5 years. You're looking at a complete refresh where the way you did one of the things in the list I just mentioned, you do it completely differently now. So that keeps you on your toes, right? It means that by definition, you can kind of never get too stable and too settled, because if you do, your business dries up and you're dead. So that keeps it exciting, I guess.
And so, you brought up Wolfpack, and if we look at some projects from your past, one being Shadowbane and the other being Wizard 101, we have some quite contrasting experiences. What lessons did you learn from Shadowbane, and how did you take those into Wizard 101?
So let me. There is a central through line that most people probably don't see between my projects, and that is that I always do crazy shit that everybody around me tells me won't work, right? That's definitely the impression of Shadowbane. If people were around and remember, there were a bunch of people saying that won't work, that won't work. And to some degree, they were right. Some of those ideas didn't work. To some degree, they were wrong, and those ideas are, quite frankly, awesome and still valid. And that's right. A lot of those are the ideas that we've gone back to try and grab and basically rebirth in Crowfall. Wizard was the same way. When Wizard was originally kind of pitched to people, the idea of a kids MMO or family-friendly MMO was kind of unknown. And I remember we did a focus group early on, and the big takeaway from it was that parents were not going to be willing to give a company their credit card if they'd never heard of the company on the internet. So that was a major concern for us is, hey, we're not Disney. So, how are we going to convince parents to give the credit card? Luckily, we just got lucky on that. By the time the game came out, that was no longer a concern of the industry. But at the time, it was a big deal. So, so that's the central through line. In terms of the actual things that I learned from Wolfpack to Wizard, I can't even begin to count. Everything from how I approached the technology to the project to the marketing to everything in my mind had to go back and be re-questioned, because Shadowbane wasn't like just this amazing, wonderful experience for me. It was actually very hard and very grueling. So all of the lessons that were learned the hard way from that, Joseph and I took to Wizard and kind of made this decision that we were not going to make those mistakes again. And to a large degree, that paid off.
Okay.
Did some new ones.
Yeah, and so we made all sorts of new, different, and equally, not equally terrible. I've really got very few complaints about Wizard or Pirate, quite frankly, not only were they great projects made by fantastic teams, but the entire process of that, going through that company and being brought in by the CEO there, literally as employees number like 2 and 3 or 1 and 2, depending on whether you can count the founder. it was a pretty fantastic process. So it was a wild ride.
Yeah, and so if we look at failure and how we approach and deal with failure, I've seen debates from both sides of the aisle. Like, for instance, you have people like Mark Andreessen who will say, today we over fetishize failure, and we sort of have an over glorification for it, and I can see examples of that in the tech world. And then on the other side, you have that failure is a very good teacher, and extreme fear of failure might be a really negative thing in of itself. What are your opinions on failure and how to approach it? Or not approach failure, but...
Given the choice between the two, I wouldn't suggest anybody take the failure just for the learning lessons.
Yeah.
But you do absolutely learn. There are lessons that are learned the hard way that you never forget, right?
Well, if you're not failing occasionally, that means you're taking no risk. That's the truth of it. And our business is really about a game that had no risk in it. No risk of making it or doing the design probably is not going to be very successful, because the audience isn't going to find it compelling because they've already played that game before.
Yeah.
Right.
In some shape or form. So in fact, risk is intrinsic to our success. At the same time, it's the greatest risk of failure.
Yeah, because you have to embrace a certain amount of risk, but risk by definition means that there's going to be a certain amount of that just doesn't pay off. So.
And so how exactly is it best to deal with it? I mean, is it about putting in more feedback loops and embracing it's better to fail faster and so you can correct course quicker rather than just going on without having any like a lot of MMOs are developed to where nobody gets to touch it till it's like so far in, and by that point you can't even correct course.
Well, that's a risk too, right? If you put yourself in a place where you have no maneuvering room, that you took a risk by trying to not take a risk. I think that, with our particular project, we embraced several high-risk things simultaneously on purpose, so that we could fail quickly if they were going to fail, or that we would know whether or not they were working pretty quickly. And I think that was, intrinsic to what we wanted to do as a company, was to say to ourselves, okay, we're going to do something that's pretty crazy. We don't think anybody will ever back this project who's a professional, game company, because they're going to go, you're taking far too many risks with this one title. Because normally the rule inside big companies is you kind of say, we're going to do 3 risky things, and you end up doing 1. That's how it normally works. Yeah. And we started with 5 or 6 right off the bat, and we're going to end up with 4 or 5 that we actually ship. So I think that's, it's something that an independent can do that a bigger company, that needs a more predictable outcome, or what they think is a predictable outcome. Here's the funny thing: all those predictable outcomes don't always come true, right? They go, hey, we're the experts at picking this stuff, and we're going to make sure all our games are hits. Okay, which company, except for Blizzard, all their games are hits, right? So most of those companies can't do what they say anyway, right? They're doing the best that they can, but it is a risky business because of all the externalities.
And even
all
Blizzard,
the things changing externally.
Right, even Blizzard or Supercell or whatever, it's not that they actually don't take some risks that don't pan out. It's just that they have made a decision and have the finances to just hide that from the market, right? They'll proceed down the line for many, many years on Titan and go, this just isn't work, or StarCraft Ghost, right? This just
isn't in the background.
So let's just scrap it. I mean, that's what Supercell is famous for, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what they wear it like a badge of honor is, hey, we kill stuff all the time. And because even they know that the risks don't always pay off, but you have to take them. Otherwise you're just making Me Too products that nobody's going to play. So you've kind of backed yourself into a corner of being unsuccessful by being too hesitant. So that's one of the things that I think is super interesting about our space is there is a level of gambling that is necessary to even play. So,
well, in our particular case, because we don't have that kind of backing, we had to do a lot of it kind of naked in front of the customers, right? Our customers are the ones who are telling us whether we're on track or off track.
Yeah.
We have our own internal barometers and we decide what we want to do, but we're confronting feedback really early in the process that is, as rigorous and harsh as the customers can be about that stuff. They're not, sitting around, patting us on the back for being awesome. They're saying, "Oh, I like this. Oh, and I hate this. Get rid of that. That sucks. Why did you even put that out here?" It's interesting, how well the customers do in aggregate in giving feedback about what you're doing.
So you can tell we've kind of embraced that across the entire company as our just management philosophy is, instead of having a publisher say, "Hey, on XYZ date, we need to see this following checklist things be done or you won't get a milestone payment." Instead, it's constantly listening to the customers and trying to discern, because they don't agree, of course, right? So we have to discern through and pick out the pieces that are what we believe to be signal from all the noise, and then use the limited resources we have to go back and iterate on the base to try and make it better. And we're not perfect at that, because I don't think any team could be. But what you can see with this project is slow, steady, continual progress. Slower than users would like, but that's kind of inevitable. But it is steady progress, right? Every week or every 2 weeks, we put something out and it's a little bit better. And it may be 3 steps forward and 1 step back in some ways, but it's constantly moving forward. It's a whole different cadence and style of building the product. At the end of the day, I think it's the right answer. We'll find out. It's new. This whole developing in front of a crowd and really almost in partnership with the crowd is a whole new and different thing, and we've embraced it. So we'll see how it goes.
And so, with y'all embracing this, more risk-taking decision-making, do you think that as far as most of the AAA titles in the past couple of years, what's really hurt the industry as a whole is we've gotten away from taking any risks? Like you said, they'll take maybe one risk at the end of the project when it's all said and done. And do you think that that's really hurt the industry as far as appealing to any audience?
Well, I think that nobody in those companies is sitting around going, "Let's get rid of all risk." What they're doing is they're reacting to the reality of the marketplace. I think I just saw a talk the other day that in 2010 EA did 70 or some odd titles, and last year they did 8. There's fewer bets on the table, right? And all the bets have to pay off. And when you're doing fewer things, your perceived risk is really high, because suddenly, like, fewer things, one of them falling out is a much bigger deal than if you're doing a lot of things. Now, we're a little company. We're doing one thing. We live or die based on one thing, period. So, we're at the wrong end of both of these, right? We're taking huge risks, and we only have one bet on the table, right? But that means that we're going to put everything behind it. Everything that we can do to make it work, we're going to do within our power. But that's the power of focus, right? But when you're a multi-game company, you've got to figure out, how do I do a portfolio of these things that are going to pay off? And you have to know some of them are going to pay off at the same time. I think that the more that you can do more things, the more likely you are to do more risk in aggregate. And the challenge, that we have today in today's market is really expensive games to build, like MMOs. The real problem with the whole MMO market, and I think of it, I started working on them in 1995. It's 2017. That's 22 years. And I've gotten to work on a lot of MMOs, but most people are going to get to work on like 2 or 3 MMOs. How good can you get if you only get to do 2 or 3 of something, right? You need to do it a lot to get better at it.
Yeah.
And these have such long cycles that our iteration cycle has been really short and low relative to, like, mobile games, when you could build them in 6 months. A lot of them are getting built. Now they're 2 years to build, and a few of them are getting built by professionals, but a whole bunch are still being built all the time. So when there's a lot of something being built in that innovative, kind of bubbling up out of that swamp of all that stuff, is some cool stuff if you can find it.
It's a numbers game, right? I mean, It's, if any given game has an X% chance of success, the more games you have, the more likely you are to have more successes. And that's the other, I think, challenge we've seen with MMOs, and now it's happening with mobile too, is the arms race, right? Is once people start to really pay attention to a space and recognize there's real money there, they can't necessarily control the risk of new games, but they think, it seems an easy way to try and mitigate some of that risk by making things that already work but better. And so how do you make a game that already works but better? Well, you take a model that works, you replicate it, and you put more and better art into it, right? More and better effects into it.
Or you do the same level of quality and different.
And different, right?
So it's a cowboy game. It's not a space game. It's a cowboy game.
Yeah. So what you end up with is an arms race where now, well, you spent $5 million on the game, so I need to spend 10 because I have to clearly outdo you to be that much better in terms of the art and the content. Oh, well, now I spent 10. That means your next one has to spend 20, and that's how you end up in a situation where now we have games like Elder Scrolls and WildStar and the Old Republic, right, where the budgets are incredibly huge. Now you want to talk about people who are taking a risk. That's incredibly scary, right? So trying the crazy kind of ideas like we're trying with Crowfall. It's like, all right, well, what if the MMO worlds just disappear after 3 months? That's a pretty risky concept. Are you willing to risk $10 million on it as a publisher? I don't know. Maybe we could have found one. Or could we found somebody willing to risk $100 million on it? Hell no, absolutely not. That would have been crazy, right? So I actually think we're at a really cool time now because crowdfunding has put us in a position where you are able to see games that can get a budget of 3 or 5 or 7 million, and that's enough that you can try some of these ideas. They're not going to have the same level of content or the same level of quality or production value as the Old Republic or an Elder Scrolls. I mean, they're just not. It's not like that team or those teams of 500 people are just lazy, and therefore if we just push a little harder on the weekends, we can achieve the same level of quality. That's ridiculous, right? But what we can do is take risks where they can't. So that's the other thing I think that typically stifles the risk is just the arms race. So I think it's really cool that right now with MMOs particularly, we're seeing this resurgence of people willing to take risk in designs, but it's coming once again from smaller teams who are playing with smaller budgets. And the only thing we need to do is get the users over the hump of not comparing us to a $500 million juggernaut.
Never going to happen.
Yeah.
It's like being compared. It's still food, right? If you go to the most expensive restaurant in the world, or you go to McDonald's, it's still food.
I know it is, but nobody does that with movies, right? You don't have independent films come out and people are like, yeah, but technically Guardians of the Galaxy 2 had way better effects than Clerks. I mean, that nobody makes that comparison. They recognize
the Clerks people don't use effects. That's how they get away.
Yeah, but I know. But my point is there's more of a recognition you don't compare an indie film to a summer blockbuster using this. It's an apples to apples comparison. Everybody knows that. With games, we don't really get that, right? We're judged alongside of everybody else, and I guess it is what it is. But it's kind of goofy. So.
And so, two key things that I heard out of it. Gordon, you said focus, and I had a idea as far as focus goes, but I think it all ties in together now. And you are talking about budgets, and what I want to know is, are these budgets for these AAA titles, are they actually warranted, or is it something? Are they kind of artificially? Were they artificially just hiked up through the roof because of the post-WoW era, and everyone wanted to take that model, and they like you said, they wanted to take that model and just make it better, and so you're having to have these huge budgets and these huge teams to put out something with so much features but make it better on the quality scale.
Well, I think they're just reacting to the marketplace, and if you can play that game, if you can play a game on the same playing field, you don't come against a superpower with a couple of handguns and a grenade, right? You better bring a whole supply train and a ton of people.
Yeah, don't bring a knife to a gunfight,
right? Yeah. So when you're fighting on that battlefield, And this is the trick, right? What we're doing is we're saying we're not going to fight on that battlefield. We're looking for a place where no one's fighting with us to play at. And, I said focus. What I really meant was desperation. The way of the samurai is desperation. It's, because it's either win or die, right? For small companies, that's we either win or we die. So we have to make it work one way or the other. But in the end, we don't get to decide that. The consumers decide whether we win or die. So we're here to make sure the consumers are getting what they're looking for out of whatever we're building.
It is a challenge, though, that you raise, I think, and it's specifically a challenge with MMOs, right? Is MMOs have a long tail. So every month that passes, if you have a successful MMO, you're making hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. And a big chunk of that is being fed right back into the game in terms of new features and new content. So now, if I want to launch an MMO, I'm not competing with World of Warcraft at launch. I'm competing with World of Warcraft that's been out now for over a decade and has had $1 billion invested into it, right? So can I really compete with that realistically with a $20 or $30 million budget? Well, if I'm trying to recreate that exact kind of experience, absolutely not. Like it's not. There's nothing artificial about it. It's a very real. Like players log in and they're like, "Hey, how come you don't have flying mounts?" WoW has flying mounts. And you're like, yeah, but they didn't at launch. They don't care whether they had them at launch or not. The point is, over here, they're serving it. Over here, you're not. So, I mean, the only option really for us, unless we had access to hundreds of millions of dollars, was to, and even then, even if you did, think about a 1 month slip, right? 1 month slip with a team that size, you just spent another $5 million or something. WoW made $5 million to put into their game. So they're not only buoyant, they're profitable. You're having to find an additional $5 million or whatever every month. You're you're chasing a moving target, chasing a moving train. It's almost impossible to catch.
It is a red ocean, right? You're fighting a whole bunch of people. There's a bunch of people fighting with you. It's not the right, particularly for small entrants, you can't, again, there's no knife to a gunfight thing.
Yeah.
You can't just show up and say, I'm gonna beat you guys at your own game. You have to make a new game.
And you can't steal their community, right? That so many business plans, I don't know, probably thousands, right, came out that said, and if we can just take 1% of the WoW user base, you can't.
10%.
Or 10%. You can't. That doesn't happen. So what you have to do instead is saying we have to go make our own community base, and we're not going after the WoW base because those guys are already getting what they want, right? So we're going to have to go after a new group. That's why Wizard actually turned out to be a pretty good model because it wasn't going after WoW customers. Right. It was going after customers that were by definition not playing WoW, and it was able to build a really nice base. EVE Online built a really nice base. It's a totally different offering. And that community turned out to be vibrant and loyal, and it's built a really long tail sustainable business for them over I don't know how long EVE has been around, but a decade or more, definitely.
Just wanted to pick off, start up where we left off, and we were talking about focus and budgets and MMOs, and I brought up the question of, do you think that the budgets kind of might be artificially set? And I guess where I was going with that was with how y'all were saying that you think they're responding to the market, and at that time, when WoW established itself as king, most companies were kind of they wanted to be WoW but better, and so by going after that, it's almost like you're artificially spiking your budget because WoW, when it was established, had so many different types of content. They had almost a little something for everyone. You had your raids, your dungeons, your battlegrounds, the open world PvP, and so by saying that you wanted to, by trying to target that and just target a broad audience in general, you're almost spiking your budget costs because you have to incorporate so many different systems and mechanics.
Well, yeah, if you try to do a superset of something, you shouldn't expect for it to be cheaper than doing the set that you're actually competing against. It's going to be more expensive. But I think the key thing is it's not that WoW had all that stuff super awesome at launch. What they did is they continued to develop it month by month with the same development budget or more than they were spending pre-launch. So every month they're getting a month ahead of wherever you are.
Right. Yeah, when they came into the game, they didn't have a lot of they didn't have arena, they didn't have battlegrounds. They added them on as they went. So when you're gonna try to compete with that right off the bat, you're already um, putting your the amount of money you're at to spend skyrockets.
And just the hours of content, just linear quest driven content, right? Is every additional hour that you add to the funnel costs you X amount of dollars, and X is a big number. So as the months tick by and you keep adding more hours and hours of content, now you're basically upping the bar for everyone else who's going to follow you if they feel like they need to compete.
Right.
And to some degree they do. I mean, back in the early days, you don't necessarily have to launch now with 5,000 hours of content, but you can't launch with 20. That's for sure.
Well, even if you think about the Conan launch back in, I'm trying to think what year that was, but
2008, I think.
Yeah, I mean, they launched and their first content, the first 20 levels of stuff was pretty good, but the moment people hit like past level 30, they were going, wait a minute, there's no there, right? Because they didn't have the money or the time to polish the content all the way to the end, and they were hoping to do some of that post-launch, but of course, players eat faster than we cook.
All right.
We can't cook it as fast
like
as
exponentially faster, right?
Yeah.
You spend you have a team of people working on a zone for like 6 months, and you put it out, and before you even get it off the test server, that first weekend they've already used it all up.
Right. And so that's where with Crowfall, y'all have more of a focused vision on where y'all want to go with the game. Y'all have a targeted audience. You aren't putting in all the different mechanics that you're not trying to please everyone and ultimately end up pleasing no one. You're not trying to have gameplay systems that's going to please the whole crowd of the MMO genre. Y'all are going more for a targeted niche.
We should hire Ward to do our interviews for us. So, yeah, thanks.
Yes, that's entirely accurate. There's really two approaches to that. One was recognition that we can't afford to do all of the systems, which is very engineering and design heavy. The other was a recognition that we can't afford to create the thousands and thousands of hours of content doing linear questing because that's so design and art heavy. So instead, we went with an open-ended approach where it's all interrelated, interconnected systems that we believe will allow players to become content for other players. So my actions effectively determine a series of challenges for you, and that takes the place of questing. So our hope there is that with a relatively limited amount of engineering and a limited amount of content, that is, you can mix and match in millions and millions of different combinations, that makes a giant explosion of play space that you guys can explore without us necessarily having to lay down the cobblestone for every one of those paths, because we can never afford to do that.
Right.
It does mean it's a slightly more dangerous approach because by definition, you guys are going to be kind of exploring this space that we haven't even explored, right? So people will find interesting, creative ways to break the system in ways that we never thought of. But that's also what makes it exciting and kind of fun. So, and we'll just adapt. I mean, that's the thing, is we do have the ability over time to change the game, to change the design, to adjust to those strategies and that exploration as it happens. So it's very organic as a process, if you think of it that way. It's kind of a dance between the players and the developer that goes on over a decade or longer.
Plus, that's sort of the only way you can really drive the genre forward is by taking those risks and by deviating from the current system that's been played out over and over and over again.
Well, that's the key, right? If you don't take risk, you're not going to get any rewards. Of course, you can also die. So those, it works both ways. I mean, but that's the thing. If you play it safe, you probably won't die, but you probably won't have a giant win either.
And nowadays you might die. I mean, that's a possibility too, right?
Yeah.
Is you can kind of hit all the check boxes and do everything quote unquote right, and still at the end you come up and it's just a lackluster product that doesn't work or doesn't appeal to people, and that's it.
And so I want to, looking at the amount of time we have left, I want to hit on one more little topic, and then I want to throw y'all through my little gauntlet. And the topic is I wanted to go ahead and go rewind a little bit and talk about Crowfall's crowdfunding campaign and crowdfunding in general. From what I remember of the crowdfunding campaign, I think it was, from what I've seen through the MMO space and the RPG space, was one of the most cleverly crafted campaigns as far as what generated the hype. And it seemed like a really cost-effective method was, and for people that don't know, y'all, I believe y'all started the campaign off with a website that had a very little teasingly amount of information and basically a countdown timer.
Right.
And you basically had everyone wondering, what the hell is this going to be? I got to figure out what this is, and basically drummed up a whole bunch of hype on the internet.
Well, we had unfair advantages, right? So our unfair advantages are our history, the games that we've worked on, the communities that we've worked with, and that teaser campaign was really mostly about two things, really. One, Shadowbane. Two, the dominance of World of Warcraft in the current ecosystem of MMOs. That we felt like that was squelching all the creativity out of our particular genre of games. Everybody had to be WoW or WoW-like or WoW with a twist. And for us, we looked at it and went, no, WoW is one expression of how to make MMOs. There used to be a lot of other expressions of how to make MMOs.
Right.
So we wanted to kind of get back to that as part of our deal. And the fact that we had people, both press and individuals, right, in communities that we could reach out to, we wanted to let them start thinking about that problem. Is why we put that problem up first. You want to add?
Yeah,
anything?
no, I mean it was Joe Gordon is completely right. It was a statement of purpose, but it was also a wink to the Shadowbane community, right? Which I mean, the Shadowbane, the vision to this day, I still think is one of the coolest game visions in the MMO genre, and amazingly enough to me, it really had never been attempted again. Right after Shadowbane, it was on a branch of the MMO evolutionary tree that just kind of withered and died. So that was definitely exciting to us. And now it seems a little bit more like obvious, like, well, of course it worked, right? Because you've seen other games now that have popped up too, also claiming that they're going to do dynamic worlds and they're going to make the world living and breathing, and it's going to be more driven by the players and stuff like that. Those have all come since us. At the time we did it, very much, it was still WildStar was the most recent thing that had happened. The only other games out there that were even talking at all about anything dynamic were EverQuest, Landmark, and
EverQuest Next.
And it was the same game at the time.
Yeah.
I think they hadn't split into two different things at the time. So it was really we were kind of going after what we saw as incredibly blue ocean. It's not quite as blue now from a noise standpoint, but from a what you can actually play today standpoint, it's still pretty blue, right?
Yep.
And on that, what are y'all's feelings as far as the crowdfunding model as a whole? Do you think that it's completely? Would you say that it's totally better than the traditional AAA method, or does it bring up its own unique form of problems?
There's no easy money.
Yeah, it's totally it's absolutely got its own problems as well. One of the chief ones being that you are now designing and developing the game in front of a crowd. They're going to see all your mistakes, and so the best advice we have is to just be honest and don't try and sugarcoat them. Just own them. Like, yeah, we tried this, it didn't work. We're going to go and fix it. The other one is just that the pace of development is incredibly slow. It just is. Even with giant teams, these games take a minimum of 3 years usually to get done, and sometimes they go on to 7 or 8 years before they get done, and that's not, I know it's easy as an outsider looking in to just assume, oh, well, yeah, but that's just because you're doing things wrong. But everybody does that, right? Blizzard does that. Every game developer does that. So at some point you have to go, well, maybe my assumption is incorrect. Maybe these things are just really hard and vastly more complicated than I realize. We had a streamer actually come through the office, and he was walking around kind of checking out what people were working on, and he was watching one of the animators. It was Doggett was working on a champion with single power, just one animation, and he was going through it and going through it and going through it and going through it, and he just sat there watching him, and at that moment it dawned on the guy how much time and care is put and crafted into every single element you see. Every button, every blade of grass, every animation, every eyeball, everything in the game. Somebody actually had to sit down and do that individual piece, and that took them a couple hours. Then, not to mention integrating it in, getting into the system, testing it and getting it out, working on all the video cards and stuff like that. It's just there's a lot. It's just a huge amount of work. You're moving a mountain one spoonful of rocks at a time. And it's easy to look at the big ticket items and be like, oh, well, look, they got physics working. But that's actually not usually what kills you. It's the weight of all of those little spoonfuls of rocks, right? One spoonful of pebbles at a time. So...
Well, yeah, and if you move them to the wrong place, you got to move them again.
Right.
So,
yeah.
And that happens from time to time. That's the rework, right? There's always rework in these games. So I think that, the challenge, part of, so with crowdfunding, one of the big pluses, you're really close to the customers. The customers who crowdfund you really care. The downsides are you're really close to the customers and you're having to explain how development goes on an ongoing basis. And, the world, and particularly our world, the first world, is not good at deferred gratification, right? Oh, good things will come to those who wait. Well, they don't want to wait. They want to, if they can imagine it, they want it, and it takes time to do it. The other big challenge, I think, is that it's really difficult to fully crowdfund a game, particularly these large scope games. When we did our crowdfunding, we said, look, we're going to raise other money.
We already had. Right? We'd already started.
We'd already raised some money. We were going to raise some more money. We knew that crowdfunding couldn't pay for the entire game, most likely. It would have been wonderful if it had, but that means we would have needed to crowdfund $12 million, not, as of today, like 3.6, right? So it's a challenge because there aren't enough customers who are visionaries and really want to see new stuff done, enough to invest in it early, which is fine, right? We love the ones that we have, and we're glad that they exist because they literally kept us from having to get a publisher who, one, would have never signed us in the first place. But even after we had some traction, if we'd had a publisher, guess what? Well, whatever we're doing would be watered down almost immediately as they tried to mitigate risk. And we're embracing some pretty big risk on purpose.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about that, it's easy for people to kind of just beat up on the publishers, but publishers at the end of the day are groups of individuals, right? So when you've got a project that lasts 3 to 7 years, you're often not dealing with the same individuals when you're ready to launch that you originally did the deal with. So that's part of the schizophrenic nature of dealing with these outside organizations is that they often just change. Literally, you're dealing with different people who have different opinions and often have different priorities, right, internally. Especially if they're like, I didn't sign this project and I don't like some of the decisions that were made, but now I'm going to have to live with it. It becomes very dicey. So we thought it would be better to kind of go at it alone. And for the most part, I mean, we've been very fortunate with our European publisher, Travian, that they've been actually awesome.
Yeah,
and
but they're a licensor.
They're a licensor, and they came late, right? They weren't in from the very beginning. So
that's a different relationship than somebody who's driving the game from a marketing standpoint, right? So we love those guys, but they are not driving our game.
Yeah, that's true.
Oh, you wake up and everything you've been working on no longer exists. You don't have your team, Artcraft is not a studio, and the Earth also happens to be facing total annihilation. Yet, don't despair. There's one thing that can save it. For completely logical reasons, if you guys are able to pull off a fully functioning PvP MMO that is an extreme success within its niche audience, then the world will be saved. You have 2 years to pull it off. You have no budget, no publisher, but you've retained all the knowledge you've gained while developing Crowfall. Gentlemen, the world's fate is in your hands. Good luck. We're all counting on you. So what would be your first moves if you were put into this situation?
Well, normally when the shit hits the fan, you run in circles, scream, and shout. That's the first thing. You should panic immediately and get the panic out of your system first. After that, you work a plan. What's the plan to fix things, right? What's the plan to get it done? 2 years is tight. 2 years would be very challenging.
Yeah, I mean, realistically speaking, you'd have to have a baseline. So I guess, and then the challenge is that licensing has not really ever been a viable option. Licensing an actual MMO engine has never been a viable option in our space. You could potentially.
It doesn't save you the time you think it would.
Yeah, I mean, you could potentially try and find a game that already exists that you could go get a license to and then make changes to it.
Well, since it's the end of the world, I assume that we would have absolutely tyrannical powers, and we could just co-op the game that already exists and that team and make them do what we want.
Right, that's what I'm thinking too.
Yeah.
That's really the only option.
It's your only choice.
It's the analogy is kind of like having a baby, right? Is it's going to take 9 months. There's just not much you can do to speed that process up. It just takes time, right? The best I've actually managed to get a game actually out the door was Pirate 101. Using the Wizard 101 base, I was able to get that game out in 2 years and 9 months.
And that's with people who already knew the engine. You
already
had
knew
an
the
engine.
I had the team. I had a art pipeline already set up. The art style was already known because we inherited it from another game, and it already had all of the secondary systems that players don't think about or care about, but you have to have, like billing systems, support systems, CSR tools, operational systems, build management systems to be able to just cut new builds. All of that stuff is a tremendous amount of work. I had all that as a benefit, so that made a huge difference, and that team was really able to hit the ground running. And even then, it still took. It didn't take 3 years. I think it took about 2 years and 9 months from get-go.
And Star Wars Galaxy shipped in about the same time frame, 2 years, 9 months. But again, it was built on top of SOEs, all the SOE stuff.
Right.
They did do a new engine, but that, still it was a miracle, a minor miracle. So the real answer to your gauntlet question is you only have 2 years. The world is going to end.
The world is probably going to end.
You're screwed.
So there's no way to maybe go after like a shrunk vision of like the core mechanics of your game. Try to make a complete game out of like a smaller piece.
But the nature is to never say never. Of course, you try, but you would fail.
Well, I mean,
almost certainly.
If you start changing the rules, right, then maybe it's achievable. If you say, actually, I didn't really mean an MMO, I meant a MOBA. Okay, well, that's a whole different animal, right? So, but then you're losing a bunch of stuff, right? You don't have race class, but you don't have character customization. You only have one level, or maybe a couple at the most. You can do peer-to-peer networking. You don't have to worry about doing a big server infrastructure. You don't have persistence of the same type, or what you do have, you can really grow into. You certainly don't have the transactional requirements. The more you start to actually scope the problem set back. Sure, but I kind of read into your assumption that you were saying we need to make a game about the size of Crowfall or something similar.
Which is really small.
Which is really small from an MMO standpoint, but still pretty damn big.
And so going forward, do you not foresee any changes to the method in general or any technological changes that will be able to shrink development times and the amount of resources that have to be poured into it?
Maybe a little bit, but not substantially. Just like making a baby, right? Getting a team to work together takes months.
Yeah.
Building a team to get them to be a team is a months-long process, and you can't compress it.
Just the content alone is going to take time, right? I mean, I suppose you could Frankenstein together something if you were to go and get a bunch of art from somewhere for like another game.
Yeah, but he said it had to be successful.
Right,
So
okay. Yeah, it has to be successful, so that's not going to work.
You're doomed.
Yeah.
We were just destroyed. There's no hope.
Yeah, pretty much. You're setting up the death of, the extermination of the race there.
Wow. Well, let's see. It's 11:05. So you know what? We're gonna go ahead and wrap it up. I thank y'all for coming on. I really appreciate it. It's been fun, and maybe we'll do it again sometime and have it done in one session without any issues.
Yeah. Well, it's the internet.
Oh yeah.
It's gotta be, can't we call 1-800-INTERNET and get it fixed?
Well, yeah. How can you save the world by making an MMO in 2 years when you can't even get the internet to work properly to film a podcast?
See, we were doomed from the get-go.
Yeah.
On the internet.
All right, guys. Well, thank you. Y'all have a great day.
All right, take it easy, Ward.